Hey everyone! Today I am going to do a walkthrough of a basic HTML and CSS website from start to finish, from creating the initial files in VS Code to actually writing out all of the HTML and then going in and styling it all with CSS. And so we have here a wireframe. So this was an activity that you all did in class, and we're going to just continue on this and kind of step you through this. So we've got this wireframe, and it is for a little profile page on your pet or favorite animal, or I had told you all in class, really just anything, any kind of, person or animal that you want to feature on this. The important part is that we just write this code and follow some kind of wireframe. So as I step through this, I'm going to start all of this code from scratch and kind of walk you through my thought process as I go through it. I'm going to throw in a little goodies like talking about CSS resets, as well as some semantic HTML5 tags. So I'm super excited to get started, and let's dive right into this. So the first thing that I want to do is go ahead and actually create all of the files that I'm going to need. So I usually like to do this by starting off in VS Code. And so I like to open a folder in VS Code instead of opening individual files. That way, if I open a folder, I'll have the contents of that folder in that left-hand sidebar of VS Code, so I have really quick and easy access to all the other files that I might need to edit for this application, and also I can see the file structure or the directory structure, so that way it's easier for me to know, like, hey, what relative path should I use for my style.css file? Or, what's the path for an image, for example? So let's go ahead and open up a folder. And I'm going to create a new folder here. So I'm going to go into my dev file. And so this is the folder that I've been using for my in-class code. I'm going to create a new folder, and we're just going to call this coding project. Please be more descriptive with your names. This is a terrible name for a coding project directory, but just for the sake of this quick tutorial, I'm just going to go ahead and set that. So then I'm going to hit open. And now this coding project folder is open. And you can see over here on the left-hand sidebar where it says coding project. And so here, if you can see my cursor, all of my files and folders inside of this particular coding project directory will show up here as I start making them. But as this is a new folder, there's nothing there right now. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder for my CSS. And I always like to start out that way. Just build out all of the files that you need, even if they're blank, and all the folders that you're going to need. So that way you don't have to go back and reorganize everything after the fact, and you stay organized in the beginning. And right now in class, we haven't been dealing with a huge number of files. And so it kind of might seem like this directory structure might not be that important, but it's good to get in the habit of good directory structure, so that way when you get into projects with a lot of files, with multiple JavaScript files and tons of images and maybe a couple CSS style sheets, as well as a slew of HTML pages, they're all organized and easy for you to find and reference. So I'm going to come into this left-hand sidebar, and up here at the top, there is a little folder icon with a plus. And if I hover over it, it says new folder. So I'm going to click on that, and it's going to create a new folder in my coding project folder, which is the one that I had just opened, that I showed you all opening in VS Code. So I'm going to create a folder called CSS. And this is where my CSS is going to live. So I'm going to click on the CSS directory and hit the new file button, which is right next to the new folder button. I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to add style.css. So now I have a style.css file made. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click outside of the CSS folder in this just blank space here on this left-hand sidebar. And so when I do that, I've now selected the parent directory, that coding project directory. So I'm going to click this plus new file button one more time and create an index.html. And index.html is always going to be the entry point to our website. That's the naming convention that we're going to use. So now I've got my directory structure set up. I created a new folder called CSS. Inside of the CSS folder is style.css. And then outside of that CSS folder, I have index.html. And actually, I'm going to make one new folder, and I'm going to call it img, and this is where I'm going to store my images once I start adding them. So let's go ahead and start off with our HTML. A lot of times what I like to do when I'm starting off with a project like this is I want to scaffold out all of my HTML first, especially if I have a wireframe and a general idea of how I want to lay out my page. And then once I have added in all of my different HTML elements, then I go back and style them. So I'm going to start off with that little exclamation mark trick, our emit abbreviation. So I'm going to type in exclamation mark and hit enter. And remember, this trick only works if you have already created a file and saved it as a .html file. By saving a .html file in VS Code, VS Code knows to enable those HTML-specific tricks, like that exclamation mark enter, to give you a baseline boilerplate code. So in here, the only thing I want to change right away is I'm going to give this a title. Since I'm making this predictably about my beloved cat Peach, this is going to be a page on her, so I'm going to call this Peach's Parade. So then the other thing that I want to do here is I want to go ahead and add in a link to my style sheet. So I'm going to do link rel. Rel is relationship. And set rel equal to style sheet. So link is my tag name. And then rel is an attribute name. And we set that equal to the attribute value, which in this case is style sheet. Then I want to set the type equal to text/CSS. And then finally, I want to give it an href and set that equal to CSS/style.css. And then close that tag with the greater than sign or that closing angle bracket. Now, there's one other thing that I want to go ahead and do here, and we haven't talked about this yet in class, and that is a reset. A CSS reset. So as we had talked about in class, our web browsers have things like certain styles that are built into each web browser. And each web browser is a little bit different. So let me show you really quickly. Let's make a few things. I'm going to do an H1, and we'll do a P, and let's do an unordered list with a few list items. So let's save that and go ahead and open it in our browser. So this is what it looks like by default. And our browser is applying certain styles here. It's applying the style for this H1 tag to be bold and big. It's applying styles for different spacing as well. But let's see what happens when we add a CSS reset. So I'm going to do a search for CSS reset, because this is not something that you would code by yourself because somebody's already written it. So I always like Eric Meyer's Reset CSS. So I'm going to click on this link. And I'm just going to copy this code. Copy that from the web. And we can see up here at the top, it has a license and it has an attribution. So that's good. We're attributing who it came from. And this license is public domain. So it's no problem at all if we use it in our code. So I'm going to come back here into VS Code. I'm going to click on my CSS folder, and I'm going to add a new file, and I'm going to call this reset.css. And I'm going to paste in that code that I got from that Eric Meyer website. So I can see here, it goes in and it looks for all of these different elements. It selects all these different HTML elements, and then it just kind of resets these styles. And it does the same for a few other selectors down here, just resets certain styles. So the idea of a CSS reset is to reset all of those built-in browser configurations, so that way we get a clean slate when we're designing, and we don't worry about, if we're developing in Chrome, we're going to tune our website and our CSS to how it looks in Chrome, but we might not be taking into account the default styles that other browsers have. So you might pull it up in Safari and it might look a little bit different because Safari might have different default CSS styles. So let's save this reset.css file, come back into our index.html, and I'm going to add in another style sheet. and this is going to be css/reset.css. I also want to put, whoops, not style, reset. I want to put reset first before I include my style.css, because remember, CSS is cascading style sheets. So we want these resets to be applied, and then we want our styles to be applied. So let's save this now that I've added my reset.css file in, and let's go back to our browser and see if anything changes. So I'm going to refresh this page and look. Oh my gosh, all of this looks exactly the same. So my H1 styles went away, and my unordered list and list item styles went completely away. And any padding or margins or anything that was on that p tag too, those went away as well. I think it was a p tag that I used. Whatever the tags I used, all of their default styles are now gone, and we have a clean slate from which to work. So now let's actually go ahead and start our coding. So let's come back into our code. I'm going to delete this stuff right here, and we're all ready. We have our HTML file set up. We have our file structure set up, and now we can start going in and actually adding in our code. So in the instructions, it said we wanted to first add a navigation bar and put 3 divs inside of it that were all going to be set to inline block. So that way we have this navigation menu. So I'm going to first create a nav tag. Now, I'm not going to give this nav tag an ID or a class because it's the only nav tag that we're going to use. If you have a small website that you don't feel it's going to be a problem for you to style an entire tag, then this is totally fine. If you had a big website or a website in which you're going to maybe use the nav tag in a variety of different ways, then you would want to start assigning IDs and classes, so that way you could specifically target individual nav tags to style them individually. But since this is a one-page application, and we're only going to have one nav tag, I don't feel the need to give it an ID or a class. So inside of this nav tag, we can see we have our opening nav tag here and our closing nav tag. So in between there, I'm going to add some divs. So I'm going to do div class equals, and then I'm going to call this nav item. And when I add that greater than sign, or that ending angle bracket, it's going to automatically create the closing tags for me. So I'm going to type in my navigation items here. So I'm going to do home, and then I'm going to select this, paste it 2 more times, and do diet and habitat. Now, why didn't I give these IDs, and why did I call them all the same thing? Well, we're going to style all 3 of these elements exactly the same. These 3 individual divs aren't going to get separate styles. Since they're not going to get separate styles, we should just give them a class with a common class name. So this way, we do not worry about having to go back if we needed to change a style and go home and say change a home ID and a diet ID and a habitat ID all at once. There will be situations where you might want to give these a class and an ID at the same time, especially when we get into JavaScript. But for right now, all these 3 elements are going to be exactly the same. And so I'm just going to give them all the same class so we can style them in bulk. All right, and there's our nav. So the next thing we wanted to do was we wanted to create those 2 big sections. We had this little sidebar section. Let's actually come back here and look at our wireframe. We have this sidebar section over here on the left-hand side, and then we have this big main section over here on the right-hand side. Let's come back into VS Code. So I used a nav tag here, and a nav tag is one of those semantic HTML5 tags. And so nav is going to tell the browser, it's going to tell screen readers and other accessibility tools, and it's going to tell any search engines or bots that might be crawling your site that, hey, what's contained in here, this is navigation for this site. And that's important information to know. So I'm going to continue using some semantic HTML5 tags here. So the next one I'm going to do is an aside. So I create my aside tag. I'm going to hit enter to just drop it down a line. And my aside is going to work as my sidebar element. And then I'm also going to go ahead in here and create a main tag. And main is going to represent that right column, which is going to have our main content. And so asides are looked at this, content that's off to the side. It might not be primary content. It might have important stuff in it, of course, but it's not our primary content. Whereas the things in the main tag are expected to be more of primary content. So let's first start off with the aside. Let's come back here and look at our wireframe. So on this aside, we've got these two sections. We have this top section up here, which is going to have a picture of our pet and our pet's name. And then this bottom section, which is going to have our pet's stats, kind of like it's a Pokemon or something. So, and then on the right-hand side, we have these two distinct sections. We've got this top section here where it says a heading for your pet or favorite animal. And then down here, the second section that has pictures of that animal. So let's come back into our code. So in my aside, I'm going to go ahead and create two divs. And I'm going to give them IDs in this case because I want to have the ability to style them individually and maybe give different styles to this top chunk of content, the chunk with the picture and the title, and then might give different styles to the bottom chunk with the pet stats in it. So I'm going to call this ID sidebar top. And then I'm going to create another one. I'm just going to copy and paste this to make it a little bit easier and call this sidebar bottom. So then this divides out, here's our left-hand sidebar, our left-hand column, and I've now divided it into two sections, the top section and the bottom section. Now something to keep in mind is these tag names in general or generic HTML, those are predefined for us. But our ID and class names, we can make up. They don't have to make sense. They should make sense. It should, somebody should be able to read your code and be like, oh, okay, I have an understanding of what this particular element does. But we could call this Billy Bob, and computer's not going to care. It's not going to know that you're a weirdo for calling your ID names Billy Bob. It doesn't matter what we call our class names and our ID names, so long as we reference them the same throughout our application, throughout our HTML and our CSS. Okay, so now I've scaffolded out some of that top part, and let's actually go ahead and scaffold out this main section first. And let me put some new line breaks in here just to kind of separate these chunks out. And I'm going to add a comment in here as well. So we'll call this left sidebar, and we'll call this primary content. And then up here, we'll call this navbar. Cool. So now let's make some section tags. So I'm going to do a top section, and this is going to contain, that picture that we're going to float off to the side, so that way some body content or body text can wrap around it, along with a little bit of a title. So then I'm going to add another section here, and this is going to be our bottom section for our pictures of our animal, pet, friend, whatever it is that you're doing this for. All right, so now if we save this, let's go ahead. We always want to code a little, test a little. Let's come into Google Chrome and refresh the page. Nothing really is here. We have home, diet, and habitat, and they're all stacked on top of each other. But we have nothing else because we haven't added any content to these elements that we've created. They're just empty elements. There's nothing inside of them, so there's no content to show. And up here, we have these three things listed, and although we want them side by side, we haven't written the CSS to put them side by side yet. So that'll come later. Keep in mind, at this point, as we go through this document is adhering to the normal document flow with all of these elements positioned statically. So they're just going to go top to bottom, left justified, according directly to whatever our HTML says. So I'm going to keep adding content in here, and then we'll go ahead and style it. So I already have some of this content written, so I'm going to copy and paste some of this stuff just so that way you don't have to watch me type out all this stuff. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add an image. So I have, let's close this to make the screen a little bit bigger. I have an image tag here. It has an ID of sidebar flag. And so this way I can style this image specifically. And I'll explain why I want to style this image specifically in a moment. Then I've got my source attribute in this image tag. So the source attribute is going to show me where this image is coming from. It is looking in the image folder for a file called peach1.jpg. Now remember, when we type out our path names like this, they are relative to the file we are currently in. So if we look back at our file tree, we're working in index.html right now. So this particular path that I've selected here, this particular path is in relation to this index.html page. So that means it's looking in this folder, my coding project folder that I created at the beginning of this tutorial. It's looking in here for a folder called image, and in that image folder for that peach1 image. I've also added a new attribute that we haven't talked about yet in class, and this is called alt. And this is for alternate text. So we want to add alternate text to our image tags to describe what the image is. Regardless of the image, we want to describe what it is. And this way, again, for accessibility, if we have a screen reader looking at it, if we have any other accessibility tools reading our website, or if we have bots crawling our website for something like search engines, we want to make sure that there's some alternative text to describe what these pictures are. So here I have a little alt text that says peaches and cream, an orange and white cat with her mouth open as if she is talking. So just a description of what the picture is. And then I'm also going to assign a height. So remember, in HTML, we can assign height and width attributes to our images to resize those images. Now, it's a good idea to resize your images beforehand on your computer and then include them in your site. So that way, whoever is loading up your website doesn't have to load all the images. I sent out the code for this particular web application earlier today, and the zip file alone was 11.3 megabytes. The pictures that I've included in this, I haven't cropped, and therefore are massive. We don't want big files when we're trying to create a website. So I took the easy way out here and resized my height inside the browser, but normally I would go ahead and resize those images themselves before I actually start including them in my code. So that way I don't have to use this height setting. The height of the actual image is already 150 pixels. But again, I'm being lazy today. Also, by setting height or width, HTML is going to be smart enough, or your browser is going to be smart enough to know to proportionally size the rest of the image. So if I set the height to 150 pixels here, then it's going to proportionally size the width to go with it. Now remember, image is a self-closing tag, so I have a space here, followed by a /, followed by a closing angle bracket or the greater than sign. So I've included an image here, I've given it an ID, and then I've put peaches and cream patelis, since that's the name of my cat, in strong tags. And so strong, it kind of means bold. If you look at old legacy HTML documentation, you'll see the use of the tag B, the letter B. For bold, don't use that one. We want to use strong nowadays. So that's all that's really on the top sidebar, is we've got an image, and then we have some kind of title for our page. So then we've got the sidebar bottom. So here I'm going to add an H2 tag, and I'm going to call this pet, or I'm going to put the content pet stats inside of it. Then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make an unordered list. So I'm going to type out those UL tags, and UL tags contain LI tags for list items. So unordered list contains list items. So I've already created a few list items for pet stats, and I'm going to copy and paste those in here. And then let me format this really quick. There we go. So now in this sidebar bottom, I have a little header for H2, pet stats, and then an unordered list with some list items about my pet. Now, I haven't given my strong tag, my h2 tag, my UL tag, or any of my LI tags, any classes or IDs, because just like things like my aside and my nav tags, I'm going to just style those as a whole. This is a one-page website. I'm not going to have multiple styles of unordered list or multiple styles of asides or multiple styles of strong tags. So I don't need to add IDs and classes for this particular more simple assignment. So I'm just not going to worry about that, and I'll style them as tags as opposed to styling them based on a class or an ID. But again, once you make your website more complex, you're going to want to make sure to include classes and IDs. All right, so let's save this file. Again, code a little, test a little. So I'm going to save this and let's open it up in my browser. All right, so we've got some stuff here. Now we can see we've got this. Let me zoom in a little bit. We can see we've got this little broken link picture image here. So that's saying that the picture couldn't be found. And because the picture couldn't be found, we can see the alt text. Peaches and cream, an orange white cat, their mouth open as if she's talking. That was our alt text. So in the event that the picture doesn't exist, then the alt text will show. But let's go ahead and add in our pictures really quick so that way we can make sure that they're working. So I'm going to come in here, pull up my dev folder with my coding project in it, open up my image folder, and then get my images that I have here, paste them in. And you can see if you look at these file names under them, they have their sizes. So these are huge sized pictures. They're really, really big, in the 3,000 by 4,000 pixel range. So that's really why we would want to size these images down first on our computers and not resize them in HTML. But again, for simplicity, I just kind of threw this together for y'all, so I haven't done that yet. But do that when you're working on a production website. All right, so now let's come back into VS Code. I can now see that this image folder is populated with images. So let's come back into Google Chrome, refresh the page, and now I see Peach's pretty face. And see, her mouth is open. It looks like she's talking. All right, so let's continue. So next, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to add one more little section that I just added for myself. So I'm going to come in here and add another h2 tag for pet nicknames and add another unordered list. So let's save that, refresh the page just to make sure it shows up. And again, all this text looks exactly the same. And that's because we used a CSS Reset. So that way we can go in and really finely tune our CSS and not have to worry about, if I view this on Safari, or if I view this on Microsoft Edge, or if I view this on Firefox, it might look different. We want to do that CSS reset so we can start from scratch and have complete freedom over what we are doing in our CSS. All right, so now we've done this left-hand sidebar and we've done our nav bar. So let's go ahead and start on our primary content. Let's come back to our wireframe really quick. So in our primary content, we have this big image, we have a header, we have some paragraphs here, then we have the separate section down here at the bottom. Let me actually mark this up a little bit for you. So let's choose a box here. I'm going to make it red. Make this line a little bit bigger. So we've got this big section here. We'll call this one section. And then let's make another box and we'll call this a separate section. And annotating like this is a really helpful thing to do to break out, where do I see logical sections inside of my wireframe? Where does it make sense to split these things up into different containers? So in this first section, I want to have a header, some body copy, and an image. So I'm also going to think at this point about what tags I'm going to use. This image is, of course, going to be an image tag. This headline is going to be maybe an h1 tag. Down here, I'm probably going to have maybe an h2 tag, since this isn't really the primary headline for this page. And then I'm going to have some more image tags. All right, so let's go ahead, open up VS Code again, and start on our section. So because I want this image to be floated so that way content can wrap around it, I'm going to start with an image tag. And again, I've already got one of those written out, so I'm just going to paste it to save a little bit of time. So again, I have an ID here because I want to be able to style this picture individually. I need to make sure that this image has a float property attached to it so that way things can wrap around it. And so I need to style this one item specifically, so I'm going to give it an ID. If I had multiple pictures on the page and they were all going to have the exact same float left property, then I could use a class here if I have multiple elements that I'm going to style the same way. Then I have my source attribute here for the destination of the picture or the location of the picture. And then I got some alt text here and I set a height. So the next thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and add my h1 tag. So Peach is a cat, imagine that. We start with an opening h1 tag, then we have content, and then we have our closing h1 tag. And then I have 2 paragraph tags with lorem ipsum text in them. So there we go. So I've added 2 p tags with lorem ipsum text, an h1 tag with my header, and then this img tag for my image. So again, code a little, test a little. Let's save this, come back into our web browser and refresh. All right, there's some more content. It still looks very, very bad. This looks like we're designing some way early 1990s website stuff. But don't worry, we're going to add CSS in a little bit and make this look nice and fresh. Okay, cool. Let's do the last section. So the last section is going to be pretty straightforward. I'm just going to copy and paste that code in here too. We've got an h1 tag for our cute peach pics, and then we've got 4 image tags with our images. Now notice I didn't give these images a class or an ID because I don't think I'm going to need to style these ones in particular. I think that they should be fine as is with their default styling, but we'll see what happens. So before we jump into CSS, let's really quickly refresh our page and see. All right, so this is what our page looks like right now. And let's kind of do a quick review. So we started this off, we made our new files, we made our directory structure, we added in our CSS files, we included a CSS reset to get rid of all the default CSS properties that are assigned from the browser, and then we scaffolded out our website. We added our nav and the items inside that we think might be needed. We created an aside here for our left sidebar. We divided that up into a top sidebar and a bottom sidebar. Then we have this main section, which is going to be that right-hand column. And then we have these 2 distinct sections, this kind of main introductory section, and then this, photo gallery section, if you will. So, all right, let's go ahead and jump into our CSS. So I'm going to open up my CSS, and so far there's nothing in here. This looks a little bit daunting, doesn't it? But don't worry, we're going to conquer this. So the first thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and just kind of start from the top down. And I'm going to style the main containers, and then I'm going to go in and start to be a little bit nitpicky with the smaller things. But I really just want to start off with those big parts of my site to get the general layout down first. And so I'm going to start off with nav. So I'm going to start off with learning how to spell. So I'm going to start off with a nav tag. And again, since this is a simple one-page application, we don't need to give this nav an ID or a class just because we only have one nav tag. So we can just target the nav tag itself. And so let's quickly look at the anatomy of this. We have our selector here. So this is what element in our HTML are we selecting. And then we've got a space and then an opening curly brace. And this is going to be the opening of our declaration block. And then we have a closing curly brace to represent the end of our declaration block. And in between here, we just get to write a list of instructions for the browser. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to break out the nav bar from its static positioning. So I'm going to give it a position of relative. And let's take a quick look at the anatomy of this. So I have my property name, and that's going to come first, followed by a semicolon. Followed by a regular colon. Then I'm going to have a space, and then I'm going to have the value for this property. And then I'm going to have my semicolon to end that particular sentence, if you will. So now I can go ahead and make a new line and add something else. So I'm going to give this a width of 100% because I want that whole nav bar to span the width of this page. And I'm going to also go ahead and give it a background color of, we're going to do CCC because that's a gray. So let's save this and come back to our browser and see what happens. All right, so now we've got this gray bar. It spans the width of the page, but we still have our items here and they don't look like we want them to look. So if we really quickly refer back to our wireframe, we've got these 3 buttons here, and they've got some padding around them, and then some kind of little border here in between them. So let's style those things next. So I'm going to come back into VS Code, and let's look at our HTML really quick. We have 3 divs for each of our navigation items, and we called them nav item. We gave them a class of nav item. So I'm going to come in here, and I'm going to do dot nav item. And in here, I'm going to go ahead and start to add some properties. So I'm going to add display inline block. And this is going to make these block elements work in line with one another. Because by default, these block elements each go on their own separate line. And we don't want that here. So I'm also going to give them the background color CCC. I'm also going to give them a border on the right side. And I'm going to say 2 pixels. So the width of that border is going to be 2 pixels. I want it to be a solid line, and I want it to be the color black. Now, I can use border in a few different ways. I can do just border, and that's going to border all 4 sides of this particular element. But in this case, I just want to do a right border, so that way we don't get any, weird funky double borders or a border on the top that looks just kind of weird. I just want to separate each of these with one line in between each of the nav items. So let's save this and open it back up in our browser and refresh. All right, so now we've got them all side by side, but they look kind of ugly. They're really hard to read. So let's go ahead and add some padding. So padding works in a few different ways. If we remember our box model, padding is what goes after the border, or inside the border, before the content. That spacing between the border and the content. Whereas a margin is the spacing outside the border between 2 or more elements. So here I'm going to do padding because I want there to be space inside the border, inside this element. Now I can, just like with border, I can set either specific locations or I can do them all together. So like I could say padding right 20 pixels and just set the right padding of these items to be 20 pixels. But here I want to set all the paddings to 20 pixels. Now, there is an order in which you do this. And so let's see actually if, I was hoping if I double clicked on this, then VS Code would give me a little hint like it sometimes does, but you'll have to do a Google search for which space here refers to which particular side of the box. So I don't remember if this first one represents the top padding, second represents the bottom. I think this one is left and this one is right, but honestly, I'm probably totally wrong and don't listen to that. But just know that each of these numbers represents one side of the box model. So I'm just setting 20 pixels all the way around. So let's save this, come back into our browser and refresh. All right. That's starting to look a little bit better. Now our buttons are a little bit bigger. They've got more space here. All right, I think we're ready to start on the next section here, which is going to be our main columns. So if we look back at our HTML code, we've got this aside. That's our left column, or our sidebar. And then we have this main section, and that's going to be the right side, or the right main copy, the right column, if you will. So usually what I like to do in my CSS is I put a blank line in between each designated section of a page. So I'm going to do a new line, and then I'm going to do a side, and I'm going to style my aside first. So I know that I want this to float to the left of the page. So I'm going to do float left. I'm going to give it a width of 25%. Now, this is a little bit different than the instructions that you were given, because I think they said to do a width of 29%, but because I used a CSS Reset, it got rid of the default padding for the aside. So now I need to add the padding back in. And remember, when we calculate the width of any particular HTML element, that padding goes into play. So we have to calculate the width in relation to the padding as well. So then I'm going to give this a height of 100%. And then padding of 20 pixels, 20 pixels, 20 pixels, 20 pixels. So 20 pixels all around this particular aside. And then I'm going to give it a margin top of 50 pixels, just to kind of push it down from the bottom a little bit so it's not bumped right up against my nav bar. I'm also going to go ahead and I'm going to give this a background color of just red, which is going to be really, really bright. But this is important for us to then be able to see what it is, what content, or, where is this aside actually going, or, what span does it actually have? It shows us the container we're creating so we don't have to guess. So I'm going to save this, and let's come back into my web browser and refresh. Okay, so now we're starting to get somewhere. We can see we've got this red sidebar here. And it's, it's still got a lot of messy formatting going on, but we're getting closer. We've created this floated left aside. We've given it a few properties, so we've got some spacing up here between our nav bar and where this aside starts. And we've given it this red color just so that way as we continue writing this particular website, we can see really clearly, where those columns are. And then once we're done, we'll take those colors out because we won't need them anymore, and we probably don't want this particular red. So now let's go ahead and do the main section. And again, I like to start off with my biggest elements first and start off with the main layout of the page and get my layout set up, and then start going in and adding in those little teeny details. For the most part, that's how I like to approach basic websites like this. So let's go ahead and do main. So if we look back at our HTML really quick, main is going to be our primary content section. It's going to be, let's open up this again and annotate it. So main is going to be this block of content right here, this whole section. That is our main, whereas this right here, that was our aside. All right, so let's go ahead and close out that. Pull back up VS Code, come into style.css, and let's edit this main selector. So in main, I'm going to give it a position of relative. Whoops, forgot my space here. Position of relative. Float is going to be right because I want it to float to the right of the page. I'm going to give it a width of 70% and a height of 100%. A margin top of 50 pixels, and a padding right of 20 pixels. Let's come back in here, because if you'll notice, we're bumped up right against this right side. So I want to add a little bit of padding, so that way, we don't have to worry about our content just running up right into the side of the browser, because that'll look really bad. And let's give this a background color of blue. Let's do light blue so it's not as jarring. Ooh, light sea green. Oh, let's be a little adventurous today. All right, now we're starting to get somewhere. So now we've got these two sections. They've got this little margin space on the top to help give us some white space. Remember, white space is important for creating individual sections and for visually breaking up content. And we can clearly see that we've got these designated parts of our page, and we can visualize where is the main tag and where is our aside. So now I think it's time to maybe start going in here and adding in some more properties to start styling this a little bit more. I think we're ready to kind of go along and do that. So let's go ahead and come into, let's see. Let's do our images. So I'm going to start with the image sidebar flag, which is this picture of Peach with her mouth open. So I want to start to style that sidebar. So I'm going to come in here under aside, because that's going to kind of be the section that I'm doing this in. And here's some new syntax for you. So I'm going to do img pound sidebar flag. So what this is saying is I want to target all image tags that have the ID of sidebar flag, and only image tags. So if I had a div with the ID of sidebar flag, it would not receive the styles that I'm about to put inside of this declaration block. Only image tags will. So in here, I'm going to give this a few different options. First, I'm going to set this to display block. Whoops. So that way it's going to take up kind of the whole space. I'm going to give it a margin of 0 auto to center it. I'm going to give it a margin on the bottom of 20 pixels. And so then that way there's some space between that picture of Peach and then her name that goes underneath of it. So let's save this and see what happens in our browser. All right, so now we've got the centered image of Peach here in the sidebar, and Peach is in green, but tell us is now one line under. So, let's see, what do we do next? So that's kind of where it starts to get confusing. Do we want to add some of the more important styling to this section, this blue section over here, or do we want to continue to really style this right section? I usually like to style my text towards the end. Not always, but a good amount of the time, I would say. So let's just do that. I want to continue to mess with some pictures. So let's mess with this picture here of Peach sitting on top of the box. So if we look in our HTML, that's going to be this picture right here. So image ID main section flag. And again, it doesn't matter what we call these IDs, so long as we reference them exactly the same here in our HTML and our CSS. So I'm going to come down here to under where I have this main section, and I'm going to pop in image pound main section flag. So again, this is targeting image tags only with the ID of main section flag. So only things that meet those two conditions will be styled using what I'm about to type in. So here I'm going to add a float left. Let's save that, open up our browser, and see what happens. All right, so now we've got some float action going on here. But if you'll notice, there's not any space between this picture and all this text. This looks really, really bad. We need some spacing in here. So let's go ahead and add margins. So I'm going to do margin right, 20 pixels, and margin bottom, 10 pixels. Now, I could shorthand this a little bit and use only one line of code to do both of these. So let's go ahead and look at that. So we're going to do margin property CSS in a Google search. And W3 Schools, my favorite. So let's come in here. Here we go. So here is how, if margin has 4 values, we go top, right, bottom, and then left. I don't know if that makes a ton of sense. Oh, it's clockwise. Okay, so maybe it does. All right, so this is what we're going to do here. So that way we can style this margin all in one line. So let's come in here. We're going to put these side by side so that way I can see my web browser at the same time. So I'm going to do another margin property here. And so top, I'm going to have 0 pixels. I don't want a margin on the top. Right, I want 20 pixels. Then I have bottom, I want 10 pixels. And then left, I want 0 pixels. So now I can delete those 2 other properties, and I've replaced that all with one single property. So let's refresh our page. Also, this assignment in general was not made to be responsive, so I need to make this window a little bit bigger so that way we can actually see what we're dealing with here. All right, so now we've got some spacing here in between our picture and our main body content. But you'll also notice that this cute Peach Pix headline and these other images, they are still somehow pushed over to the right. So let's see if we can fix this by chucking in some styles for this section. Let's make this full screen again. I'm going to come back into index.html, and you'll notice that each of these sections are contained in a section tag. So the pictures section is a section tag, and then this main introductory section is a section tag as well. So let's add a selector for section. So this is going to style both of my selections. I'm going to give them a position of relative. I'm going to give them a width of 100% and a margin on the bottom of 50 pixels. So this way, hopefully, we will have 100% of the width. Each of these sections will take up 100% of the width that they have available. They're going to be position relative, so that way they'll stack on top of each other by default because they keep some sort of normal document flow. And underneath of each of these sections, we're going to give a little bit of a margin, which is the space outside of any particular element. So that way we've got a little bit of spacing in between our introductory section and our photos section. So let's save this, refresh the page. Aha, there we go, that did the trick. So now I've separated these two out into distinct sections. I've got this top section here with my little introduction and this bottom section here with my pictures. So now I think it might be time for us to maybe do a little styling. How about that? All right. Yeah, let's go ahead and start styling some of our text. Actually, the first thing that I want to go ahead and do is I want to get rid of these background colors because I don't think I need them anymore now that I have an understanding of where these particular blocks are, these two, sections of code, this aside and this main tag. I have an understanding of where they are and the space that they occupy, so I don't really need those helpers anymore. So I personally like to add in all of my global styles at the top of my CSS file. So global would be things like styling the body, or styling your typefaces, or styling just any generic tags that you might want to use throughout your entire web page. So I also want to add a custom Google font. So let's do a quick refresher on that. So let's go to fonts.google.com. And I'm going to choose one of my personal favorites, Montserrat. I'm going to click that little plus button here, and it's going to come down here and say family selected. So I'm going to open that up. And then all I need to do is copy 2 lines of code. I'm going to copy this link here. I'm going to come back into my code. And I'm not going to paste that code into the CSS file. I'm going to paste this into my HTML file. And I'm going to paste this link in between my reset and my style.css, because remember, CSS cascades. So we want all of our styles to be reset, then we want to add fonts, and then we're going to do all of our custom stuff. So if we take a quick look at this, it's another link. It's got a rel to this URL here, and it's a fonts.google.com URL. And then it is also a style sheet. So if you were to actually visit this URL, and I would encourage you to do so, just take a look at what that style sheet looks like. It might not make a ton of sense, but it'd be cool to see what it looks like. So now if I save this, Montserrat is kind of like installed, if you will, but if I refresh the page, nothing happens. Montserrat isn't in use yet. So I need to come back to my Google Fonts site and copy this bottom section, the specify in CSS section. I want to copy this line of code here. I'm going to come into my CSS file and I'm going to add this to the body. So the body and HTML are kind of the two parent-most tags that we can style. So if I want Montserrat to be used throughout my entire website, then I want to add it to the body. Because it is cascading in nature, every single child of that body tag is going to get these body styles. So let's save this and just make sure that my new typeface works. All right, cool. So now our typeface is installed. So let's start doing some styling. So I'm gonna first style my, let's do my H1 tags. So in H1 tags, you usually have a little bit of a margin to space out your H1 tag or your H1, your header, from the rest of your content, because you don't want your header to be jammed right up next to your content. Remember, white space is important for establishing things like hierarchy, and also gives users a understanding of where their eyes need to go and helps reduce confusion. So inside of my H1 declaration block, I'm first going to add a margin on the bottom. And I'm going to do 20 pixels. Then I'm going to set my font size to 20 pixels. I'm going to align in the center. So I'm going to center my first level headers, and I want to make the font weight bold. So code a little, test a little, save that, refresh the page. Look at that. So now we've got these H1 tags, and they're a little bit bigger now. They're bigger, they stand out a little bit better because they're centered, and we can see that they're clearly different from the rest of this text. So I'm going to come in here and let's do my H2 tag. So I'm going to go ahead and do margin bottom 15 pixels. Now, because I'm using H2 tags, let's take a look at where I'm using them. I'm using H2 tags in this bottom sidebar, in my aside, that left-hand side, for my pet stats and pet nicknames. So not only do I want to add maybe a margin on the bottom, but I might want to add a margin on the top too. And it's really going to be up to you and really what works for your particular project to see where is the best place to add margins when we're doing things like headers. You might not always need to have top and bottom margins. You might need to have top and bottom margins on every type of type that you use on your site. It's really going to be kind of a case-by-case thing. So I'm going to do font size as well, and I'm going to set that to a little bit smaller than my H1 to establish type hierarchy. Set that to 16 pixels. Set my text align to center, and my font weight to bold. So let's save that, come back into this page and refresh. All right, cool. So now I can see my pet stats and my pet nicknames are a little bit more centered now. They're a little bit bigger and they're a little bit bolder. But we've still got more work to do. So let's do the paragraph tags. So let's actually take a look at this and discuss this first. So these are our two paragraph tags. This is a little hard to read. And you really have to remember that just because it's not hard for you to read doesn't mean it's not going to be hard for other people to read. There are a lot of different reasons that people have a hard time going about reading things in general. It could be, general vision problems. It could be dyslexia. You have no idea what could cause somebody's, issue with reading. And so we really want to make sure that our type is readable. So I want to do two major things here. One, I want to add the line height property. So that way, this line here, let me highlight these. This line here that I've highlighted is a little bit farther away from this line here. It'll make tracking easier. Also, I end this paragraph here in this area that I just highlighted and started a new one here. And so I want a little bit of space in between each paragraph to really show the reader that, hey, this is in fact a new paragraph. So let's go ahead and change our p tag. So I'm going to do a margin bottom, and I'm going to set that to 10 pixels. So let's save that and see what it looks like. So pay close attention to right here, this line that I've highlighted and this line that I've highlighted right here. Now there's a little bit more space in there. We might actually need to add a little bit more, but I'm not sure yet. So now we know that those are two distinct paragraphs. So next I'm going to do a line height. I'm going to make my line height 25 pixels. All right, so that's going to be a lot easier to read for a lot of people. We're going to have less of a hard time tracking between each line, and there's going to be ample space between each paragraph to denote that, hey, this is a change in paragraph. I can also come in here and maybe make the font size a little bit smaller. That's probably the smallest that I want to go. That actually might even be a little bit too small, but I'll just leave it for right now so that way we can move on. All right, so I'd kind of say that maybe this side of the page is done. We have our floated image here with Peach. So we set, let's look at our code here. We floated this image and we gave it some margins so that way it wasn't bumped up right against our text. We also set these sections so that way they are two separate sections. They don't run up against each other either because they have a margin on the bottom. And then we went over here and we made some changes to our body to add a new font family. And then we also went through and started to add some text styles for our H1, H2, and P tags. The only other one that I want to do is I want to do the strong tag and change the font weight to bold. So that way Peaches in cream, her name is a little bit bolder. All right, so I think that there's really maybe only one more thing that I want to go ahead and do. And that is I want to go ahead and add some line height for this unordered list. So here we've got this unordered list. And I want each of these list items to have a little space in between them because this is hard to read, especially right here. Average walk per day, walk, you know I'm a cat, right? So that could be misconstrued as, oh, hey, that's one like, that could be misconstrued as two separate line or list items. So we want to make sure that people know that, hey, there's a little bit of spacing here. So I'm going to come up here and I'm going to do UL space LI. So this is another new one. So what we're saying here with UL space LI is we're saying we're looking at all UL elements, but we are only targeting and selecting their list item children. So this is only going to style list items or LI tags that are children of ULs or unordered lists. And so I want to add a margin bottom to each one of my list items, and let's start off at 10 pixels. All right, that's a little bit better. I think I want to maybe bump it up to like 12. All right, I think that looks good. And I think that might be all that we need to do here. So that kind of concludes this tutorial. If you have any questions, please let me know. Feel free to, if you are watching this and are not in my class, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. I am at Hannah Patellis, HANNAH PATELLIS. I'm always happy to answer your coding or UX related questions on there. Otherwise, class, I will see you soon. Thanks for watching, and I hope that this helps.